Now let's talk about the StuG and the origins, at least the well-documented origin we have, the original memo from Manstein from June 1936 and the answer from the General Staff on this memo. And Manstein immediately points out, okay, in Germany, but also in other countries, we currently have the discussion between tanks and Sturmgeschütz assault guns. And it seems that in some cases there's a mix-up between the two. And he notes, technically, these vehicles are very similar, but tactically they are fundamentally different, and we need to think about this, and we need to develop tactics and make us this self-clear before we basically build them and introduce them in large numbers, that we know what we are actually talking about. And he points out, the main aspect of the tank is to break through fast and then hit the enemy in the rear or in the flanks. Meanwhile, for the StuG, it's there to follow the infantry, but not lead the attack of the infantry, but destroy enemy gun positions, machine guns, gun positions, fortified positions that the infantry can push on. So very different. The tank leads, the tank pushes through, but the StuG basically lays back and it follows the infantry in the attack. But the infantry itself is leading the attack. And this also, then he makes the comparison, like, because some note, okay, you should have a tank and the tank should go ahead of the infantry, while others argue the tank should stay with the infantry. And he makes basically the point, you know, with the cavalry, nobody said the cavalry should slow down to the speed of the infantry, but he also said, but nobody ever said to the infantry, yeah, they should run with the cavalry. This doesn't make sense. And here he makes this comparison. He notes, okay, technically they're very similar. Both are tracked vehicles mostly. And he also specifically, that's very interesting, he says the assault gun not necessarily must have been a casemate, it can also be a tank with a support gun. So basically he already liked what the Sherman 105 would become. So he makes this very clear. He then notes three particularly points. He first notes, okay, Panzer divisions, these are independent divisions that are capable of fighting because they have all arms in them. So they have infantry, they have artillery, they have combat engineers, they have all the supporting arms, and they are there to help the tanks achieve their breakthrough, and that their main goal is a fast breakthrough, particularly on an unprepared enemy. That they break through the enemy lines and attack him in the flank and or rear. But he makes also clear that the tank is not doing very well, likely against prepared enemies, and that there are other measures must be taken. Now the second point, he points out that there are also tank brigades, which consist basically mostly of tanks, and they are there to basically set a weight of effort on a particular day by the General Staff or something, or to exploit something. But these cannot fight independently because they are lacking all the other arms. So these are basically purebred tank units. And finally then he notes the Sturm artillery, the assault artillery is there to go with the infantry and support the infantry in the attack, and that it follows the infantry.
This was from my new book about the Sturmgeschütz battery. If you want to learn how a StuG battery operated, be sure to check out my translation of the training, employment and command of the assault gun battery from 1943. There's currently a 20% discount from 13th July until 2nd August and 15% on all our other books. The book is about 200 pages. It is a translation of the complete Army Regulation 200/2M with additional documents, including Manstein's original memorandum to the General Staff and its answer. Additionally, there's a glossary that explains all the key terminology. If you want the full StuG Life experience, you can also get the German version. You can see it by the cover on the flags. The pages of the documents of the English and German version are on the same positions. You can do a side-by-side comparison. The exception is the glossary because that is alphabetically ordered. Get the books on militaryhistorygroup.com. See also the link in the description. During the translation into English, I found several errors in the German edition, so I released a second corrected edition. If you own the first German edition, you can find the errata linked in the description with the corrections. Thank you for your support.
Now he explains that the role of the Sturm artillery is that basically of a support artillery, what was the light artillery in the First World War, that joined the infantry in the after the attack. And he specifically mentioned it's not the goal of the Sturm artillery to break through or break in, but to support the break-in and breakthrough of the infantry, to engage enemy targets that are very dangerous to the infantry, machine gun nests, fortified positions, that basically the gun drives forward, engages the enemy, and doesn't stay in position and moves backwards. So basically shoot and scoot. Go there and also sometimes go back and get ammunition, so that you have like this mobile force that not pushes, but that carries forward the attack of the infantry. Another aspect he notes is that the Sturm artillery also should serve to a certain degree as a support of the light artillery, and for that it should have a range of 7 kilometers as well. But mostly it should engage in direct fire support and in direct fire. But he also mentions this part that in indirect fire it should have a range of 7 kilometers. And then he particularly notes that it should also be capable to deal with tanks, because it should support the infantry and it should be an offensive anti-tank weapon. So basically he predicts already which the StuG finally will turn into in its tank destroyer role. He briefly also talks about the organization, and he basically says ideally every infantry division should have a battalion with 3 batteries inside, and 1 battery should have the size of 6 StuGs, which is actually very small if you compare it to tank companies. I mean, battery and company are basically equivalent. The battery is from the artillery, because a tank company at that time was about 20 to 30 tanks. So we're talking about pre-war. They were pretty big at that point. And then he also makes particularly clear that this unit should be organic to the infantry division. So that's very important, that it is part of the infantry division, that they train and work together. And this is generally what later in war always comes up, that the infantry and tanks don't do rather well usually, particularly if infantry and infantry from an infantry division and tank from a tank division have to work together, because the tankers, they see the infantry not like as something they should support. Meanwhile, the Sturm artillery, the assault artillery was always like a supporting arm, and they were there for the infantry. Finally, he makes a request for a trial unit to basically test out the tactics, and he specifically notes, you know, we can use the light tanks and put a wooden gun on them, because what we want to do now is we want to develop the tactics before we have the actual weapon. So then when we have it, then immediately we can basically go into action. And now let's look at what the General Staff answered. So the General Staff answers, and he says, we basically agree with the technical assessment and the tactical proposals. Although it's pointed out that it's very important that the difference between the divisional artillery and the assault artillery is made clear. And it's stated that the range of 7 kilometers doesn't make much sense, because the StuG should be only employed with the infantry, and the maximum range of 4 kilometers is enough, because it should deal with immediate threats to the infantry. And that a further muddling up with long-range engagements or something would make the basic requirements for this weapon system more complicated for the Waffenamt.
Now, before we summarize, don't forget that from 13th July to 2nd August, there's a 20% discount on the assault gun battery books and 15% on the other books.
And finally, it's particularly noted that the Sturmgeschütz should also be able to be used as an anti-tank weapon, and that it should be able to deal with enemy tanks, and that it should address the preliminary development on an anti-tank destroyer that were already made. And finally, it is agreed that a tactical trial unit should be established. Big thank you here to the Panzermuseum Munster for inviting me. Thank you to my supporters on Patreon and Subscribestar. Thank you to Tobias and Andy for supporting me behind the camera. Thank you for watching and see you next time.